Hello friends, and welcome to another edition of Transformational Astrology. I'm Henry Seltzer, and we're going to be talking about this eclipse that's coming up tomorrow, which is a powerful eclipse and definitely needs to be talked about. But you know, I'm really kind of prepared to talk about the whole first half of the year because I know people are concerned about that. I've been getting, in my other appearances in private life too, I've been getting a lot of questions. What's coming up in 2019? Oh my God. I mean, is it going to be like an easy year? Because 2018 was such a hard year, it can't help but be a better year, right? And actually my short answer is I always say it's going to be a very intense year leading up to 2020. And I'll show you some of the details of that so you can see the evidence for it. So let's go to the chart and take a look at this eclipse chart that we have coming up here. And right here. And we're jumping right in. Those of you who are still arriving, we're going to be talking about this, Capricorn eclipse, new moon eclipse, right at the 15-degree mark of Capricorn, which I think is kind of interesting also. It's not a fixed sign, it's a cardinal sign. The 15-degree mark of fixed signs are considered important degrees. I almost feel like by extension, this one too, the 15-degree mark. And also, we have to note the 15-degree mark of Capricorn is quite interesting because of the sextile it makes to Neptune. And you can see that right here. Neptune's at 14, 2 signs away. The new moon is at 15. So what do we make of that? Well, we say this is a pretty powerful hit on Neptune because, and we've had a lot of Neptune lately. Anyway, the December 6th new moon was also in close, it was squaring and in partile square to Neptune. So we do have a lot of Neptune going on, and that's a little talk all in itself because Neptune has a couple of different sides to it. I mean, on the one hand, we can say music, art, dance takes us out of ourselves, poetry. You always see Mercury, Neptune in poets, in the chart of poets or musicians. It really is a way of going beyond the physical plane of 3 or possibly 4 dimensions, counting the dimension of time, and getting into what we tend to call other dimensional realities, even though there's no scientific physics for that. And so Neptune is really a pathway to that. And it's also very psychic. People with Neptune moon oftentimes are extremely psychic. They connect to events that are not happening in their immediate vicinity, or even they may be future events. So that's one side of Neptune, that it's a very, you could call it a very spiritual, numinous energy that takes us out of ourselves. All of the outer planets, probably including these new ones that I've been starting to study, which are Eris and Haumea primarily so far. Maki I've been studying too, of course. Those are the 3 that were named in the Kuiper Belt beyond the orbit of Pluto. And Pluto is a 248-year orbit, but these are even more so. Eris especially is very long orbit, 550 years. Haumea and Maki 295 years, and then 310 years, I think, is Maki. So these are very interesting objects to be studied. And when I say the outer planets, you might think about including them, because certainly Pluto is one of the 3 traditional in astrology outer planets from the 20th century astrology that we inherited, that is a humanistic astrology. And Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto are very important in Western thinking, and also especially in mundane. When we think about, for example, Pluto and Uranus were conjunct in the 60s, and we had such a huge situation there. The 60s were so amazing as a departure from the existing status quo society, which was getting kind of stuffy. Now again we have, in the teens that we're in the midst of, we have Pluto and Uranus in square, and that square alignment lasts until 2020, which I think is very interesting. And then in 2020 we have these big Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto triple conjunction by the end of 2020. So by the November actually. So this is all very interesting stuff when we think about what's happening in the sky and what's happening on Earth with human affairs and what's happening That's mundane astrology, but also what's happening in our personal lives. And they really do mirror each other. The chaos and confusion we're seeing in the society is mirrored by a certain degree of chaos and confusion that we're feeling internally, because we don't have a very good, firm sense of what's the rudder, how are we holding firm to a course as a society or as individuals. And my answer to that is you always have to go to depth within yourself, figure out what it is that you stand for, and act on this. And this is, of course, a theme that comes up when I talk about Eris, the feminine warrior energy for soul intention, to go deep and understand what your values are and articulate those values and act upon those values. So all of this is in play right now. And I'd like to show you some of the configurations that are bouncing around in this eclipse, which is an extra powerful new moon. So we want to take a look at everything that's happening in this configuration. And as far as Eris goes, well, let's take things in order. So all of the outer planets are actually, and when I say the outer planets, I mean the three traditional outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, are very involved in this eclipse scenario. As far as Uranus goes, the close conjunction, it's 6 degrees away in this configuration. With Eris and Uranus, which was exact in the summer of 2016 when we had the crazy presidential election here in this country, and we had all kinds of feminism on the rise and surprises. Brexit happened. So these were things that we weren't expecting, and of course Uranus is full of unexpected, it's full of rebellion. Tried to break free from, Jeff Green called it freedom from the known, which I think is a terrific description of Uranus, that you break free of the traditional constraints and limitations that you've been operating within into new territory. Could be true in relationship, could be true in self-examination. You find new facets of yourself to start to explore. And with strong Uranus in the sky right now, the recommendation is that you stay open to possibility, that you look at what would be formerly unimaginable and at least consider it, and consider that maybe things are more wide open than you expect, than you would normally think, that maybe the possibilities are there for you to break free of old constraints, to break out of crippling habit patterns that were holding you back. And of course, also with Uranus right now, we have Chiron at 28 degrees of one sign away in Pisces. So the Chiron-Uranus has been very strong months now. And I think that's part of this whole pattern. And then what do we see in this new moon configuration, this very important new moon, solar eclipse new moon? We have actually Venus at 28 degrees of Scorpio, making an inconjunct or 150 degree aspect to the Uranus. So that brings a greater consciousness about the Uranus. And we can also, something else going on with Uranus, but I can't remember exactly what it is. Well, one thing is that Neptune is actually, if you add 15 degrees plus 30 degrees, you see, so that's a 45 degree angle. So there is, and you can put the mouse on it, of course, too. I can read it off. Uranus is in semi-square within half a degree with Neptune. So there is a pretty strong Uranian component to this new moon energy and the eclipse energy, and also, which I've been talking about, but I'll mention it again because I think it really is important, the midpoint of Eris and Uranus, which are still in their, they haven't worked out of their conjunction, and they won't until 2020, another one that goes till 2020, is that the midpoint, if you look at it, is about 25 degrees and, almost to 26 degrees. It's very close. And here we have 26 degrees across the zodiac, and this is Haumea. You can click on the Time Passages software, you get a little description of explaining the mythology of it. And Haumea is an earth goddess energy. It has a lot to do with profound connection to nature. When we first started seeing Haumea prominent, a couple of things happened. Over the summer, there was a prominent new moon Haumea conjunction. I don't think it was a conjunction actually, but it was in the configuration. And that's when Kilauea started, which it makes logical sense because it is a Hawaiian culture creation goddess, and not only that, the mother of Pele, which is the god of the Hawaiian eruptions. But anyway, what that has the effect of when the Earth shows its strength, and there's problems, and it caused a lot of trouble on the Hawaiian island, and the big island of Hawaii. It brings Earth issues to the fore, does it not? And that's maybe one of the ways that we do get Earth consciousness and environmental consciousness is when the Earth kind of erupts, there's hurricanes or flooding or fire, and we say, oh my God, we have this climate change issue that is affecting wildfires. The hottest 4 years on record are the years 2015, 2016, 2017, and 2018, the 4 hottest years on record. So anyway, I think this configuration is very significant, very important, and it stays with us for the first few months of 2019, which I think is fascinating. So my feeling about this is that Earth issues are very much part of the zeitgeist right now. The whole issue of climate change, the whole issue of climate change denial, if that makes sense at all, the whole issue of profits. The fossil fuel industry has been known to pay scientists to have the anti-climate change, man-made climate change attitude. Because, why? Because they have profits to be made in selling fossil fuels. They'd rather slow the development of alternative fuels, which is very important right now, obviously. So I think that Earth issues are going to be important in 2019, and I do see it not only in this new moon configuration, which they say eclipses last for 6 months, so this is a pretty strong harbinger for the first 6 months of the year, but also you see this configuration repeated. What's going to happen is that Haumea is going to station at 26 degrees and go backwards on the 24th of January. So when it does, it stays at this point, and then also, what is that? Oh, road work. I hope you guys can't hear that on the mic.
Yeah.
Well, we're getting a rumble. Sorry about that. The Earth issues are coming to the fore, even where we speak right now. And then we have also Eris and Uranus staying around the 26 degree mark, at least for the first few months of 2019. So that's 26 opposite 26, bringing Haumea to the fore, bringing it to the fore along with this rebellious energy of Uranus, and the idea of progressiveness, the idea of going beyond current limitations, trying to break through to another level of defending the Earth from climate change. So, and you know, the CO2 in the atmosphere, greenhouse gases. And of course, the fact that Uranus and Eris are both involved in this, Eris is so much about telling your truth, standing up for yourself. Standing Rock was a good example. The Women's March on Washington the day after the inauguration, or the week after the inauguration, was a good example. There's really a lot of the power of women on the rise, the Me Too movement, the number of women that have just been elected to the U.S. Congress here in the United States. This is really a very prominent time for the rise of women as well. And I apologize for the rumble. It's almost like the Earth is speaking to us. So what else can we get out of this configuration? So far we've talked about Uranus and we've talked about Neptune, and I feel like both of these are very important in this new moon eclipse configuration that we're coming up. It's for the rest of the month, it's for the rest of the first 6 months perhaps, so that we could see, you know, there's a brilliance and a beautifulness of this, because Uranus and Neptune in combination really signals the rise of new religions, for one thing. It's like a new, fresh sense of spirituality, a way to break free from traditional religious forms, fundamentalist forms that are not working any longer. Oh man, I hope this doesn't keep up like this.
I don't think they can hear it that well.
Maybe we can't. Hopefully you can't hear the rumble. We have this huge rumble going on in the building right now because of the road work. But anyway, so Neptune and Uranus, very interesting that they're part of this, very strong part of this new moon configuration. And then what about Pluto? That would be the question. And from the first glance at it, it does not seem, even though it's actually the rising point on the west coast for this eclipse of 21 degrees of Cancer opposite the Pluto, it doesn't really seem as though Pluto is that prominent until you look at the parallels. But you know, I've been talking about this, that Saturn and Pluto are not only parallel within half a degree right now, but it's getting stronger. As Saturn gets ready to station the end of April, there is an increasing, it's moving in the same direction to go closer and closer to Pluto's declination. So right now, Saturn is at 22.4 at a minus direction. Pluto is also minus 21.9. So that's a half a degree, but you know, as it actually dips down, Saturn gets to 22.5, 22.6, 22.7, and gets closer and closer. I mean, sorry, 21.5, 21.765 gets closer and closer to Pluto, which drops a little bit from 21.9 to 21.7. So it turns out that the pattern here is that they get increasingly close over the next few months. And then Saturn stations in April and then moves in the other direction. You see it backs up, and also the declination goes the other way. And so they stay in very close proximity. And another thing we'll be looking at is this square between the position of Eris and the position of Saturn, which is already pretty close, but it gets even closer. This is 23, almost 23, to 20, but it gets even closer to 23, 23. And then, of course, that's part of the 2020 configuration, the end of November, when not only do we have the triple conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter as well, and Pluto, right after the election and then till the end of November, but Eris is at 23 degrees all that time, just like it is right now. In other words, even though it's a year away and then the rest of the year away, more than a year away, it doesn't move very fast. You know, it actually moves 1/4 degree a year by the fact that it takes 120 years to go through Aries. It takes longer to go through Aries than any other sign. That's the furthest point of its orbit. So that's why it's going so slowly through Aries. Went into Aries 1920 and comes out 2040, so 120 years more or less. And therefore you can just say, over that 120-year period, to cover 30 degrees, it's 1/4 degree per year. Then it moves back and forth, though. You'll see it move a couple of degrees by the motion of the Earth as it goes retrograde, a degree or two, and then forward again, but it slowly makes progress. The same time every year, you'll see it 1/4 degree further. So that's a very important factor, too, because Eris really highlights anything it touches, in a natal chart especially, and in these configurations in the sky, it will greatly enhance the presence of Pluto. So that's how Pluto comes into this over the next little while. Now you can see where I'm going with this, I believe. We know that Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto being prominent is a tension and a massive cultural transformation. With Saturn and Pluto especially, you see a structural change taking place. You know, we've got to admit that the structure of the society is changing right now. And will that get all of a sudden easier and full of peace and light? I mean, there's a certain amount of rapprochement between the powers that be on the Republican side of things and on the Democratic side of things. They're making nice to some extent. There's been a little bit more diplomacy. You know, there was a couple of liberal bills that got passed about gun control and a couple other things that the Republicans put through, but of course now we're having this standoff about border security and a wall. And I don't want to offend anybody out there. I'm sure there's many people that believe that a wall is totally necessary to keep undesirables out of the country. But the real situation on the border calls for different measures. People have called the wall a medieval solution, a 5th century solution to a 21st century problem. And basically there's a lot of ways to do border security, and they need enhanced capabilities down there. They need more people, they need more training, they need more medical, they need more facilities to house people, and they need to resolve some of the legal issues, whether somebody presenting themselves for asylum is legal if they're just caught as undocumented immigrants on the wrong side of the border, on the U.S. side of the border. Do they have the right to apply for asylum if they're fleeing death in their own country? And of course the liberals are all about that. Yes, they do have that right, and the conservatives and the Republicans in Congress are all about trying to hold that back, even though immigration is not such a big issue until Trump made it an issue. But that's my politics, but I won't go there. But I will say that this wall that he's calling for is kind of a symbolic thing, and that the Democrats are very strongly opposed to funding it after all the funding that's gone by for the tax relief and so on. Republicans seem to be very firm and adamant on their decisions. So we're not really seeing a peaceful situation in Washington, D.C. this month. And I think that the evidence in the sky is all of this outer planet strength that we do see. So my short answer to the question, isn't 2019 going to be such a relief and so much better? And boy, we're finally done with 2018. No, I think we're really in the midst of a huge cultural shift that's taking place. And the 2019 is a continuation and maybe even more intense. So I could actually show you some of the other charts that go into this. It's very interesting to look at the new moon that follows this solar eclipse new moon. And I've got some of these queued up. So the February new moon is again at 15 degrees of the next sign, which is Aquarius. And the interesting thing here is that we have Saturn at 15 degrees, we have Neptune at 15 degrees, making a perfect sextile with each other, a partile aspect together, so that we have a lot of Saturn-Neptune, which really is a conflict because Saturn is about practical matters and Neptune is about matters beyond. And we get into this whole other issue that I started to describe with Neptune, where there's the deceptive quality of Neptune. There's the issue of fake news. There's the issue of who do you trust? Who do you believe? Do you believe the scientist community that says climate change is real and it's happening, it's caused by greenhouse gas emissions from the pollution of the atmosphere? Or do you believe climate change denial people who say it's not really happening, it's not the same we think it is, it'll just go up and down, the climate changes for whatever reason. So, you know, you have these two competing points of view on what is really happening, what is the truth here. And many other examples, of course, where, you know, Trump says black is white, everybody believes him. Well, actually, you know, he says other things as well. But, you know, I'm sure he's doing a good job on some level. I don't want to lambaste Trump and say he's a terrible leader, but I think he's on the wrong side of history in some of this. And it looks like there's going to be a lot of intensity trying to resolve these issues that have already gotten kind of very far out of alignment with the way things normally run, with normal civility and respect for law and order, which has been kind of thrown aside in some cases in this new administration, at least last 2 years. So what we have is an increase in the intensity that we've been seeing. And this is another one of those new moon configurations here in February, where the new moon itself sits at the midpoint of this Saturn-Neptune question mark of what's practical and true and what's fantasy and we don't know, and what's news and what's fake news. And then here's the new moon comes along right in the middle of it, conjunct Mercury. And here you can see also that Mars has come to the 23-degree mark, which is where Eris is. And here now Saturn is almost 22, so that's getting closer and closer. In fact, if we look at the next one, which would be March, you can see that Eris at 23 degrees, now Saturn, well, that's about the same. We go to April, and we see 23 degrees with Pluto. But because we're going slowly with Eris, it's still at 23 degrees. So that is a perfect square, a partile square. So that brings Pluto very much to the fore in this configuration. And the fact that now Uranus is getting into Taurus is very interesting because that's a whole different way of looking at Uranus to be in Taurus rather than Aries. It brings up issues of the Earth again because Taurus is an Earth sign. It brings up issues of change to the Earth environment, to our daily lives, the way we do our practical details of life, to our values. So that's another big factor. It's been happening. It's already been in Taurus and then backed up into Aries, but now this year it stays in Taurus, goes into Taurus and stays around April, a little bit before, at the end of March actually. So these are just very interesting things to see, and we'll take questions on these too, and there might be more coming up. I'll just show the June 3rd new moon, which is now at this point Neptune and the new moon are no longer very close together, 18 and 12, so they're not going to be that close. But we still have the Saturn-Pluto conjunction getting stronger and stronger. Now Pluto's in retrograde, and we have still that square between Eris and Pluto to think about. And I'll just show you one more chart, and then we'll take it open to questions, I think. I had the election day chart for 2020. So now we're looking at November 2020. It's not a new moon. The moon happens to be at 15 degrees of Gemini. The sun in Scorpio at November 3rd election. And you can see this triple conjunction, which I've been talking about, which a lot of astrologers have been talking about, with Jupiter, Pluto, Saturn. The Pluto is very close to 23 degrees. It's not quite there. It's a quarter of a degree off. And here we have Eris at 23 degrees moving backwards. It gets closer and closer by the end of the year. And then, of course, we have, which is not shown here, the conjunction finally when Saturn crosses into Aquarius. Jupiter catches up, and we have at the 0 degree Aquarius mark a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, which is the first one in air signs in many years. So this is very interesting, too, because the element changes. And now we're starting to have the Jupiter and Saturn conjunctions every 20 years in air signs, and maybe that's a harbinger for the age of Aquarius. So this is all very interesting stuff, and you can see that election day is going to be a rather intense time with a lot of squares, with a T-square actually between Mercury and Haumea in conjunction, and these planets in Capricorn, and then Eris at 23 degrees of Aries. So it's all pretty intense coming up, I think, these next couple of years. So we'll put it back to today. And I think I'm ready to open it up for questions, if that makes sense. I don't think I've left too much out of this new moon that we've been talking about. So do we have any questions?
We have lots of questions.
Lots of questions.
Okay. Hello, everyone listening out there and watching.
Leslie Benson, our cheerful producer.
So our first question comes from Keely, I hope I'm saying your name correctly, asking what might one expect when eclipses conjunct features in one's natal chart?
Oh, that's a very good question.
To be specific, the lunar nodes.
Oh, okay, that's another question. So if an eclipse comes along and you happen to have something, let's see, this one is 15 degrees of Capricorn. If you happen to have something at 15 degrees of Capricorn, it's an entirely significant event. It would affect your life for months, and it depends on what the planet is, of course. So if the planet is the sun, it's going to be issues of identity and who you are and how you make your way through the world and how you understand yourself. If it's the moon, it might involve mother, femininity. It might involve nurturing, your own nurturing behavior for yourself or for others. Those are the different, if it's Venus, it might be relationships. Those are the various factors that each planet brings. And you say now anytime there's a new moon, forget about whether it's an eclipse, anytime there's a new moon on a planet in your chart, it's always a significant event. Now, when it's an eclipse new moon, we'd say it's even more significant. And then, of course, the other thing we say about an eclipse degree is that later on Mars can contact that. Now, not so much with this eclipse degree, because Mars, if you look at it, is right here in Aries, which is another thing I didn't mention, just crossed into Aries, its own sign. But, and therefore squared to Mercury, which is interesting. A lot of energy right now, a lot of energy for conversation, talk about things, try to work things out. But, the fact of the matter is, when it goes all the way around to Capricorn, which will be, it takes a while. It doesn't go as fast as Venus does, or Mercury. So it won't be right away, but maybe a year from now or something like that. I'm not sure. That would be also considered a significant a significant moment when Mars crosses the eclipse degree by transit. But anyway, an eclipse degree is very important, and if it does line up with your nodal axis, it's even more important. And then you would have two possibilities, lining up with your south node, lining up with your north node. Now, lining up with your north node by conjunction would definitely be a stimulus for getting on with it, for your progress towards your evolutionary development, because that's what we say the north node is. It's where you're headed, what you might not understand too well, but what you might need to take up in this lifetime. If it conjuncts, on the other hand, the south node, that would be a little different. It would still be an evolutionary moment. It would still be that you are finding your way forward in a certain way. But it would be maybe more from the standpoint of illuminating what you have left behind, what your talents are, where you're coming from, it might in some sense hold you back to some extent from making the transition you need to make. So it's something to be aware of with the South Node a little bit more. With the North Node, it's exciting, it's new territory. So that's that.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah. So, got any more questions?
Yep, we've got more questions. The next one is from Shannon asking, hi, I was curious if you're familiar with the Saros cycle and which one this eclipse pertains to.
Aha.
With the way that eclipses have longer lasting effects, it makes me wonder if investigating this cycle will give more clues about the movement of Jupiter towards Saturn and Pluto, where it will cross the path of the eclipse. Thank you.
Well, that's a great question. The Saros cycle is important. I have not done the research on this eclipse to find out which Saros cycle it belongs to. And so the book I could recommend for that is, well, it's called The Eagle and the Lark. It's a book about understanding transits from a very deep perspective, and it includes a discussion of the Saros cycle and which eclipses in which years are part of the same cycle and which are part of a different cycle, because the cycle repeats every 19 years, as I understand it, and if it's part of the same cycle, you could look back 19 years and say, what was going on then? I think that's right. But yeah, that is definitely a good thing to think about in regards to some of these mundane issues of what's coming up in 2020. I agree with that.
Great, thank you. Our next question is from Jacqueline. I am still a new student and do not have access to all the books that I would like, but I am curious for more information about the Saturn transit on natal Juno and Chiron.
Well, anytime you have a Saturn transit, it's a couple things. It could be, Saturn is considered malefic, and people used to be afraid of these things, and people still are. And they say, oh my God, Saturn's going to be in my sun degree, oh my God. And of course, the thing is, there's no such thing, really, as a bad transit in astrology. And so what's the positive factor there? And the great book on this is called Saturn, A New Look at an Old Devil by Liz Green. And she talks about Saturn conjunctions with various parts of your, the Saturn transits. And it is a deepening effect. It is where you have the lessons that are long-lasting, even though it may take you a while to get on top of it, to get past difficulties that you encounter, because it does slow things down. It does make it hard to get anything done in that area of your life, or whatever the planet is that is being conjuncted at that point, or by opposition or by square. Primarily, those are the difficult aspects. It's a good lesson, it's like a way of really tuning into what is the maturation phase of this thing that I'm dealing with. And that happens with Chiron in a couple of ways, because there's the Chiron cycle, which is a Chiron return, like a Saturn return, which happens at age 30. The Chiron return happens at age 50. So that's one way to tune into your Chiron. When you go through that Chiron return, you really get a much better handle on inner wounding and what was going on there, how that might inhibit you at times, because you have this past trauma that has its residue in the present time, and so you have a knee-jerk reaction to whatever experience might trigger an earlier experience you had with usually parental authority, parental control, also with siblings, also with any early experiences that were traumatic. So that it all comes into the picture with Chiron. So if you're having Saturn on Chiron, it is another maturation process for that sense of your earlier wounding, and that's the best way to look at it. That's the positive side of looking at it. You could say also with Chiron being transited by Saturn that you want to look at your natal Chiron that's being transited, and you want to see how that is in your chart. You want to try to understand that better. And there is a slowing down factor, and you could also say that there could be an authority wound coming up, where Saturn representing authority, where you feel you tune in more fully and perhaps in an uncomfortable way to what authority really means for you in your life, and how you might have a knee-jerk reaction against it, against any kind of authority, if you had some examples of authority that wasn't in your best interest when you were young. So it's a good summary.
Great, thank you. Our next question is from Micah, here with us on Facebook. What is your perspective on the impact of a transiting north node conjunction to a natal south node in terms of karmic soul path?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, anything that stimulates the nodal axis definitely involves your own evolutionary progress, which they say, you know, there's a contract, or they say you had an idea coming into this life of what you were trying to get a better grasp of, or they say it's karma, that, you know, you did something in a past life that maybe wasn't so good, and now you have to deal with it from the other side of it, like being a victim of the same thing. Those kind of things can be part of what you're going through. I think it's important to recognize that what we think we have on one superficial level of just being in this life and moseying along and getting our kicks and getting our progress and our achievements and figuring out what it is that we're trying to accomplish and so on, you can look at it from a very mundane standpoint, that this is what my life was about, and then I, you know, got my estate together and I had kids and then I died, right? But the other thing is that you probably, there's a soul agenda, and there's other things that are going on that we're not so much aware of in our conscious minds. That's what I believe, and that's what a lot of astrologers believe, that there is a reincarnation. The soul goes, you know, life after life. And in that sense, it's very important to see what's coming up with the nodal situation. Now, the reverse nodes, where the north node transits the south node, is just a station along that roadway where you're learning more about what you're here for, what you're really up to, how the things that you came in with, your talents, are sometimes what you have to leave behind in order to go the other way. If you're born with a south node in the first house, north node in the seventh, or the opposite, you know, the house of relationships, your task is, even though you're very comfortable in yourself, your task is to reach out and form partnerships and learn how to be with others. And if it's the other way around, you have the north node in the first house, well, then your task, even though you're very comfortable being with people and partnering with people, your task is to learn to be independent. So those are the kind of things that you can tune into when you have nodal axis activation.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Next question is from Kirsten. She is from Australia. And
cool.
She has a general question about modes. I'm going to try to paraphrase. It's a little long. She would like to understand how the cardinal, fixed, and mutable signs are affected in general during an eclipse, and particularly during this one, since the axis is activating water and earth.
Okay. I'm trying to get a handle on how it's activating water and earth. It is certainly an earth sign. It's activating Capricorn, and that is in the cardinal cross. In other words, any planets you might have at the midpoint or near the midpoint of any cardinal sign, be it Aries or Libra or Cancer, you would have some factor going on here, because it's making those strong aspects. You know, it would be making a square in opposition to, or a conjunction to, that planetary point. We talked about that a little bit, that if you have an eclipse that's coming in and it's activating a planet in your natal chart, it's really a good time to pay attention to how that planet functions in your chart. That's the study that you'd want to be doing. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, especially since the water element, the moon is, of course, a water bearer. I mean, water carries the element of water, not the water bearer in the sense of Aquarius, of course. But anyway, yes, I think especially the Earth and the cardinal axis.
Thank you. The next question comes from Maggie. If I have Sagittarius and Jupiter, how will Jupiter traveling through Sagittarius affect me?
Well, you're in the process of having a Jupiter return, since you started with a Jupiter in Sag, and then you'd want to pay attention to not only the whole transit of Jupiter through Sagittarius, which is a good and lucky time. Every 12 years is kind of a lucky time. You know, the birthday of age 12, 24, 36, 48, 60, all lucky times, and 72. So, you know, when you have that happening, you might want to also pay attention to the very degree that Jupiter's occupying, because there is very specifically the Jupiter return date, which happens, and it could also retrograde back over it. So, you know, there could be a little section of time there where Jupiter is really hitting your natal Jupiter, and that's a very positive time, generally speaking. Jupiter is lovely. It's expansive. It's good luck. It's good fortune. It's optimism. It's cheery. It's connection with nature. It's a good time to be alive. I could use your power cord, I think, if you're okay. Make sure we don't run out.
Great. Okay, our next question comes from Suzanne. She says, I hope this isn't too elementary, but could you explain a little about the moon's nodes? What are they? How do they determine eclipses?
Oh, very good. Well, we have different planes within a three-dimensional space surrounding the Earth as far as the astronomy goes. And the plane that we mostly talk about is the plane of the ecliptic, which is the sun and moon defined plane. Now, obviously the Earth makes a circle around the sun, and therefore that circle is within a plane. Now, the interesting thing is all the planets are in pretty much the same plane, not precisely, of course, but the plane of the ecliptic, most of the planets operate within that. Some are more of an angle to it than others, like Pluto is more eccentric and has a big angle to the plane of the ecliptic. But the moon in particular, when it goes around the Earth, doesn't have that same plane. And so if you were to take the plane defined by the moon and the Earth, in other words, you're looking now at that other circle of the moon's orbit, and you make a plane out of that, just say this is an entire plane here, that plane cuts into the plane of the ecliptic, and there's a descending node and an ascending node, and those are the places where the moon's orbit intersects with basically the orbit of the sun of the Earth around the sun, which seems like the sun around the Earth when you're looking at it from a geocentric standpoint. So they always thought that was very interesting timing, because even though these are abstract points, the north node and the south node of the moon, and all the planets have nodes relative to the sun. That's a different thing. That's a planetary node. But the moon's nodes are considered to be an important part of our sort of personal evolution on the Earth. And the ascending node is the north node, and that's where the moon in its orbit is going above the plane of the ecliptic, and the descending node is where it goes below. And the reason that has to do with eclipses is because if the moon happens to be at its nodal point when there's a new moon, when the sun and moon line up, as they do every month, that's an eclipse. In other words, that's a time when you could actually see the moon completely blocking the sun, and all you see is the corona of the sun around the moon. It's a beautiful, beautiful sight. We had it not this past summer, but the summer before that in a lot of the western United States. So that's the explanation of the eclipse, that because they're lined up not only longitudinally but also in declination, the sun and moon occupy the same visual space in the sky, and then the moon actually blocks out the sun pretty much exactly. And then on the lunar eclipse, it's opposite the sun, so that's a little bit different. It's in the shadow of the Earth, the moon is. But they both have that characteristic that they're very close to the nodal points, so the nodal points have that effect also. And what's also very interesting to me is that the sun and moon, even though they're quite different in size, as you know, the sun is gigantic compared to the moon, but the moon is so much closer. So they subtend the same disk, if you can buy that. In other words, well, I mean, if you can buy that as a coincidence, congratulations. But I don't. I mean, I think it just shows that we have a very specific earthly environment here, which is kind of geared to our spiritual evolution, which obviously we have, or we wouldn't have astrology that works. So I think it's a fascinating thing that those two disks are exactly the same size.
Agreed.
And you agree. That's
great. Our next question.
Yes.
Ready?
Yep. Sure.
It's from La Chingona Estrella. She's here with us on Facebook.
Oh, cool.
Asking, would a personal transit be more significant than the current chart of the stars?
There's two ways to look at charts, for sure, of transiting charts. Right now, what we're looking at on the screen is the chart of how the planets line up with each other. But if we wanted to see how that hits the chart of the United States, for example, what we would do is we would bring up a different chart, the USA chart, which I happen to have right here. And we would actually put the transit date of this eclipse that's happening. See, whoops, here we go, transits. New transit. And so it's January 5th, right? And I think the timing of the eclipse is, it's early, right? Do you remember what time the eclipse is?
Oh,
Doesn't matter. I'll just put 9, I'm not sure. Anyway, so what we have is, we're looking at the sun. It'd be another 8 hours away, so it's actually 9 at night tomorrow. But you can see that the interesting thing about this eclipse in transit to the United States chart, now you're looking at the way these planetary alignments, which are still aligned with each other in the sky, so it's important. And I should probably put the 9 or 6 p.m. or something like that. Sorry, I'm taking a little time with this here. Another 8 hours, something like that. I don't know.
still need the time of the eclipse?
Yeah.
5:28 p.m.
Okay. Well, I'd already kind of deduced that. So that means that both the sun and moon are lined up with each other at around the 15-degree mark like this. That's not quite the exact time. It doesn't matter. And look what we have. It makes a perfect square to the Saturn in the U.S. chart. So we'd say, aha, not only is this an eclipse that affects, for example, Neptune being part of this eclipse because there's a perfect sextile in the sky between Sun and Moon and Neptune, but we'd say, how does that hit your chart, Mr. USA? And it makes a square to the Saturn, which is the executive. It's also the organization in the 10th house here and of the natal chart, the USA chart, which is 1776. July 4th, 1776. 5 p.m. we say, or 5:13 p.m. is the actual rectification by Dane Rudhyar. So that's, I use that, which he made it 5:13 and 55 seconds p.m. LMT. And so anyway, what we see for sure though, no matter what chart you use, is that the sun and moon in this eclipse configuration are making a square to the natal or the radical Saturn in the 10th house of the USA chart, which does correspond to the leader. It does correspond to the executive branch. It does correspond to structure, the structure of the country. And what do we have just at this very moment when the eclipse is taking place is we have a radical restructuring of the U.S. government to where now the Democrats have control of the House of Representatives. So, you know, this is how astrology works. It's, you can't make this stuff up, as they say.
As they say.
So,
ready for the next question?
Yes.
Okay. Next question is from Ellie. She joins us often. Thank you for being with us, Ellie. She's asking, what is the significance of 15 degree points of the signs in the eclipses as opposed to the 29-0 anarectic degree?
Well, like I said a minute ago when I first started, that the 15 degree mark of the fixed signs, that is to say Scorpio, Taurus, Leo, and Aquarius, are definitely considered to be power degrees. And then you're right, the 0 degree point also power degree. The very first degree of the sign, the kind of the energy coming in very strongly at the beginning of the sign. Which also, by the way, a lot of people feel like if you're cuspal, that is to say you're born right around the 21st of the month, you might be Aquarius or you might be late Capricorn. It does matter because if you're on the Aquarius side of that, the energy of the 0 degree point is very pronounced. You know, you're getting a real hit of Aquarius there. So it's important to know your chart well enough to know which degree it is, whether it's 29 Capricorn or whether it's 0 degrees of Aquarius. It makes a difference. It's not just all blurry there. But, you know, yeah, I think that's very, very interesting what you raised, the 29 degree point. I don't know if the 15 degree point of Capricorn is very significant. There are different degrees that are significant within signs that have been established since medieval times, and I don't think it's one of those special degrees. So maybe less so than the fixed signs, but maybe to some extent it has a little moxie to it, you know, being the 15 degree point. So it has that that flavor of being exactly, if you divide the cycle of the 360 degrees by 12, you get 30 degrees per sign, and then if you divide it by 24, you'd have the 15-degree mark being significant. So perhaps so.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Shout out, we have 2 birthdays here with us today, both Akasha and David, so happy birthday to them both.
It's also my granddaughter's birthday.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, Hannah's birthday.
That's great. So David has a question in light of that. He's wondering what happens when the solar return, which is astro fancy way of saying birthday, coincides with an eclipse.
Very good. Well, you know, it does depend a little bit on what the degree of your sun degree is. Now, if your sun degree, you know, the fact that you're born on this day, the 4th of January, your sun degree may not be exactly 15. So it might be a degree before or after. So because it depends on the year too, you know, there's leap years every four years. So there is that question mark. If it were to be 15, then you have what's considered to be a very strong solar return. You have a new moon solar return, and then if it's an eclipse, it's even more so. You have a super new moon solar return. And anytime you have that kind of a solar return, it does mean it's a big year. So right away you could say, hey, this is probably a big year for both of you. You'd really want to look and see what your solar return chart looks like. And you know that's something you can calculate in the time passages software. I don't have one showing here, but basically we can just bring up a personal chart of some kind, but I don't have any that are very handy. I don't think I'm going to do it right now, but you bring up your personal chart and then you display the solar return for that year, and then you'd find out how it was really looking, if that solar return, if that eclipse was right on your sun degree, that would be even more major, for sure. And then you'd want to know, is it a new moon that hits before or after your actual solar return? That's the other thing. So before, that would be another new moon, a big year, because the moon is just starting out in its cycle when you look at your solar return. But if the solar return date was actually such that the eclipse happens ahead, you know, it hasn't happened yet when you're looking at your solar return, that would be a kind of a culmination year. That's a little different. But yeah, definitely it's a big year. It's an important thing to look at.
Great, thank you. Our next question comes from Patricia, asking, what is it like being born in Aries during a Libra full moon?
Okay. Well, this particular full moon, of course, is a Capricorn full moon, so I guess I could translate that to say, what if your sun degree is 15 degrees Libra, and it's really hitting your chart. Now, if your sun degree is 14 degrees Libra, it's still really hitting your chart. If your sun degree is 2 degrees of Libra, then it's not so much hitting your chart. So you'd want to see how it lines up. You know, if the sun and moon are actually making within a 4-degree boundary or so, you know, a 4-degree orb of your natal sun degree, that's going to be a very powerful time for you by transit. You're looking at the transit there, not the solar return.
Cool, thank you. Next is Yvette asking, what does it mean when someone is born during Saturn retrograde?
I don't think it means much, to tell you the truth. Now, the retrogrades of the inner planets, you definitely would want to say that. Like if you're born in Mercury retrograde, you're more introverted, more thoughtful, you know, you kind of take a look at things and take your time thinking about them. Mars retrograde is interesting because rather than being outgoing and aggressive, you might tend to internalize that and be mad at yourself. You know, so that might be a difficult thing, or it might be just something where you're not quite as aggressive as you might be. You know, you kind of take your time again and don't. So the inner planet retrogrades in a natal chart are very important to check it out. But when you get, and then maybe Jupiter, but by the time you get to Saturn, it's retrograde about half the year. And I believe that it's pretty much Saturn either way. I mean, I've never noticed much of a difference there. And if you have a lot of retrograde planets, that might be similar to having a Venus retrograde or a Mars retrograde, that may be more internal. And you could say that the Saturn is available to you in a more internal way, perhaps, but it's subtle. You know, it's basically not that different from having Saturn direct, nearly. So.
Great, thank you. Our next question from Melanie, and she's asking, how do you know when your Saturn return happens?
Well, the best way would probably be to look at your chart in software and see where Saturn is. Look at your transit chart. Your Saturn return happens when, if we were looking at a natal chart here, like we were a minute ago, let's pretend this is a person, the USA chart. So their Saturn return would happen when Saturn was, Saturn's a 28-year cycle, so there's 7 years in each of these. So it would happen just about 7 years before there would be another Saturn return. Of course, every 30 years there'd be a Saturn return. Whenever Saturn comes to its natal position again, and by the way, it's not just Saturn. You have Jupiter return. We just talked about that. All the planetary bodies have returns. You have a Venus return and a Mars return as well, and it's just an extra burst of energy because they don't last long and they're not that significant. But certainly a Jupiter return is significant. Uranus return is 84 years, so it doesn't happen to everybody. It doesn't happen very often. And those are the ones that you can actually look at. But yeah, it's important when it hits that point. So you'd want to look at it, but basically you'd want to look at this at the actual chart and see what the degree of your Saturn is. That's what you'd have to do.
Cool, thank you.
One way or another.
Next question is from Nicole, who's here with us on Facebook, wondering, what does it mean if all of your chart points are grouped into one spot?
Well, you do have stelliums, and that's a focus of energy. Somebody that has a lot of planets in the 11th and 12th, for example, they're very focused in that way. They're, intent on the beyond with the 11th and 12th. If you have it in the 1st and 2nd, you're more intent on being here, fully exploring your experience on Earth. But it's one-sided. You tend to be one-sided and kind of focused in one area of life, two areas of life, rather than being general, which is a splash pattern. If they're all over, like we have this chart, is more of a splash pattern. Although this chart is actually close to being, if we disregard these new ones, this is Maki Maki, by the way, introduced you to Maki Maki. I haven't talked about it, but it is opposite Mars right now. It is also a profound connection with nature from an activist standpoint. It's more of a environmental activist. And then Haumea is profound connection with nature, more from a standpoint of just loving nature, being exposed to nature, being exposed to the spiritual experience of a path to spirit through nature. Anyway, if you leave out these, it is a pretty concentrated chart. So, everything in this 150-degree section here. So this would be an outer-oriented person if it was somebody born today, because of the top of the chart is outer and the bottom of the chart is inner. So you could see where the focus comes.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Our next question is from Brenda, also here with us on Facebook, wondering, do you work with Pholus and Nessus as well? If yes, how would you interpret them for your 2019?
Oh, well, I haven't been looking at Pholus and Nessus, although in the time passages software you can look at them. So we could do that. If we go to chart points and we decide to say, let's see the centaurs, which is what you're talking about. Here is Chariklo, which is another one, and here's Nessus, which is stylized N, and then Pholus is a stylized P, and Pholus is right at the top of the chart conjunct Mercury. So you would say, and this is an eclipse, so you would say this is an important placement of Pholus. And I don't really work with Pholus and Nessus that much. Pholus actually, see if I can remember. I probably shouldn't say because I'm not really that versed. If you click on it, you get a little bit of interpretation of it. It talks about there may be a Neptunian theme involved with Pholus. But anyway, I'm not an expert on that. I'd rather not shoot my mouth off. But you can see that Pholus is prominently placed in this chart, being right at the beginning of Aries and also being closely conjunct Mercury. So that may add to the Neptunian times that we're having with this prominent Neptune in this chart. I like in the software how you can put these in and then take them out because it gets so complicated. So it's nice to be able to just display without those and see a more simple chart, and then also be able to check them out.
Great. So we're at 2 p.m. right now, so I think this will be our last question.
That makes sense.
Thank you all for being here with us today and for all of your wonderful questions. Last question is another one from Micah, and wondering, what is your perspective on the dynamic of mutual reception, such as Mars in Libra and Venus in Scorpio?
Very good question. That definitely is a factor when you see mutual reception, as was just described. That is to say, the planet is in the two planets are in each other's sign. So Venus in Scorpio, and then Mars in Libra would be ruled by Venus. So that's a good point. Yeah, when you do see that, you know that there's an interaction between Mars and Venus, that there's a way that they're kind of in each other's space, so to speak. They're tangled up and they're involved with each other, which you also see when you have a chart that has a conjunction of Mars and Venus. And I always feel, and I think this has been borne out by all my experience, that Mars and Venus together means a very strong self-sufficiency. Not so much in the mutual reception case, which is maybe just more there's a Mars-Venus going on and a Venus-Mars going on. But in the natal chart, when you do have that conjunction, which you see every once in a while, it's a very self-sufficient person. They don't need to reach out for love, or, you know, they're very kind of self-fulfilling in that way. It doesn't mean they won't be in a relationship. It just means that they are very good at handling things on their own. Okay, well, I guess that's all we can do right now. It is an hour, so we better get off, I think. But I hope I was able to convey a little bit about what I think is coming up. It's just so important to recognize, and maybe I'll switch back, that you know, these are times that really call for self-examination and trying to understand what your role is better and better. And I do recommend astrology for that as well, by the way. And we have all these tools on the website that we try to make available so that people can explore what's going on. And oh, and we have the year ahead. That's right. On our year forecast for 2019 is on sale right now too. That's a handy thing. It just lists all the transits that are taking place over the year.
For you personally.
Yeah, for each person. For your natal chart, you have to put your chart data. So the other thing is, though, about the Time Passenger software is it's just a way to explore more fully, and astrology in general. It doesn't have to be with our product, of course. It's a way to explore what's going on with you and to get another mirror of what is really happening for you and what your life might be about, what your current situation might be about. These are tough times, you know, and I think it's really important to recognize the responsibility that each one of us has, as well as the role that we can play of being just kind of knowing where we stand on the important issues of the day, knowing where we stand in our own lives, knowing where we're coming from, why we're doing what we're doing. We're not just in some job that seems to be what can make money, but what we're doing is very deliberate. You know, we're involved in a deliberate act of creation with each job we have, with each sentence that we utter. And it's important that we do that. It's a very important thing. You know, we tend to throw ourselves away. We tend to think, well, there's nothing I can do. I'm powerless in the midst of this huge societal shift that we're in the midst of. But by taking an interest and by articulating your point of view, and by just feeling into what you really believe and acting on that, that's what you can do. And it really is a way to remove that feeling of helplessness from your psyche. It's, I'm doing what I can do. It's a very good feeling. So, I mean, that's where we're at. I mean, I do think that we're going over a waterfall in this society, this culture, and it's going to be hard to shake everything out, and it's going to involve recognition of climate change and what might have to happen in terms of lifestyle, in terms of letting go, which is what Pluto is all about, is letting go, and transforming, and maybe finding a better fit for ourselves, maybe feeling happier about what we're up to in the process of just seeing where the tendency of our life is and what really motivates us, and just digging into what's involved with our own personal transformation, our own personal evolutionary development. That's important stuff, and for each one of us, no matter who or where or what we are up to, it's a very important factor. And the vibrations go out from what you do. You affect other people around you. So just remember that you do count, that you are important, and that you're collectively, we all of us, are making the world we live in. We're creating it every day. So happy 2019, everybody. Happy New Year. And talk to you soon. Take care.